continue with the migrant workers topic together with Niels van Doorn. Niels van Doorn will manage the panel. Well, you can see it now as well. So so Niels, I would suggest welcome and present your panelists and go ahead. If you go a bit over the time, that's fine. Meanwhile, I will now and then interrupt if I have the feeling that you take too much time, but in general, up to 3 o'clock, a bit after 3 o'clock is your panel. So good luck, Niels.
Thank you. Thank you, Pauline. Yeah, I'm glad to be moderating, or as you call it, managing this panel. I hope to be a good manager. I'm just, so my name is Niels van Doorn. I work at the University of Amsterdam. I'm an assistant professor there in New Media and Digital Culture. I also am the principal investigator of the Platform Labor Research Project. And in that capacity, I have also been doing quite some research on the role of migration and migrant labor in gig economies, especially in Amsterdam, Berlin, and New York City, where my research is located or focused, my fieldwork. So I'm briefly going to just do a very brief introduction, first of the panel, and then of the two panelists, and then we right away will get going. So yeah, this is a really, really important topic, and I'm really glad that Wage Indicator has devoted a whole afternoon to this. Because with markets concentrating predominantly in and around large cities, gig platforms across the globe, and especially in this case, food delivery and domestic work sectors, appear to depend as much on the relatively cheap labor of migrants as on the investment capital they receive and on permissive governments. So I really think that migrant labor is the third necessary resource for these companies to exist next to investment capital and permissive governments. And accordingly, there's an urgent need for us to center migrant experiences and the role of migrant labor in gig economy research, as is currently being done in various parts of the world, in order to generate a better understanding of how gig work offers opportunities, but also presents new challenges to migrants with a variety of backgrounds, as well as education and skill levels. And I think the video, as well as Laura, has already given us a lot of examples of this, a lot of stuff to think about. Now, we hope to, in this panel, contribute our share. So while my own work on this topic focuses on the European and United States context, and our keynote speaker, Laura Lam's research has been carried out in the Canadian context, as you've just seen, here I will be speaking with two great panelists who work in the Indian and East African, specifically Kenyan settings respectively. So after I have briefly introduced both panelists, they will each have about 3 minutes to share their vision on the panel topic in kind of like a pitch format. And following these pitches, we will hopefully have a stimulating discussion that offers you, our audience, some insightful ideas to chew on during the rest of the afternoon. So my first, our first panelist here today is Divya Balam. Divya is an assistant professor in the Department of Social Studies at Flame University, Pune, with a doctorate in international studies from, oh, and here we go, this is a tongue tire for me, tongue twister, I knew this was gonna go badly, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. She has received several scholarships and research grants, and her teaching and research interests include international, internal, and forced migration, the India Gulf Migration Corridor, migration governance, the Indian diaspora, and refugees in the Indian context. She's an active public speaker on themes related to migration and refugees, and well, we're really happy to have her here with us today. Christopher McClay is the global director, is our second panelist, and the global director of youth employment at Mercy Corps, where he's supporting the emerging ecosystem of startups working on the future of work and the platform economy. He has spent over a decade working in the youth employment and economic development space in Africa. I assume specifically East Africa, but we can ask him. And also in Asia and in his native UK, working with NGOs, donors, and the private sector. Most recently, he was the COO at Link, a startup connecting informal workers to jobs in Kenya. So now that you know who we're dealing with and who you are dealing with, let's give him the floor. I'll start with Divya. Please take your about 3 minutes and give us what you got. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hope I'm audible. All right. I'm really honored to be part of this event, and my sincere gratitude to the organizers of the event, the Wage Indicator Foundation, and all of you listening to us. A very good evening from India. It's 6 p.m. here. So yeah, to give you a context of what I'm going to discuss and how gig economy can be the future of work for India. There are two things which, we have to, in the onset, I think, have to be clear about. The rise, it's the rising unemployment in rural India. At the same time, the low employment rate in urban India. So creation of job is an imperative, and so is the inclusivity of the jobs created, because in the later section of my discussion, I'll be discussing those various dynamic, complex social categories which we are dealing in this diverse in this country of so many of diversities. There is no doubt that the gig economy is the fastest emerging and evolving sector of work in India, with so much potential for employment and income generation in both rural and urban areas. And this has been kind of the evidence during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has actually showed that there is this demand for online platform work, and actually a lot of labor supply on that side is happening in India right now. And I think we should also bring into the conversation India's huge digital market. It's about 560 million internet users, and more than half of the country's internet users are of the working age. And I think, they can actually overcome this young population, productive population can actually overcome some of the constraints of the Indian traditional local labor markets by using these digital platforms. But then for sure, I think I have to point this out, the major roadblock here is the digital divide. Again, something which is very, very, I think, something which is very pertinent in our conversation today is, we can see that the conversation around gig economy and telemigration is not really integrated into the mainstream conversations around labor migration in India. So you kind of talk about it in two separate, I would say, rooms of discussion, and we don't really mingle these two together, migration and gig economy. You will find very few studies connecting, the aspects of migration with gig work and the emerging and evolving gig economy. However, we could see that many migrants who have migrated to the urban centers of India are actually working in gig sectors, be it be ride-hailing such as Uber or Ola, e-commerce platform like Amazon, Flipkart, Big Basket, food delivery platforms like Zomato or Swiggy. So we could see them there, but then we don't really look at their identity as a migrant most of the times. And also something which is very interesting about India is this regional pattern of migration that is associated with work in the gig sector. So you could see interstate migration, where workers migrating from his own home state to a different state, and also intra-state migration, within the state migration. So these two, in fact, these two corridors are equally strong and powerful and equally evident. But again, as I mentioned, not much studies have gone into actually identifying these features. Also, something which is interesting about these corridors, I would say migration corridors, they are long established. There is a well-developed migration infrastructure because of obviously earlier migration, that is basically to work in constructions, sector, or I would say textile industries, factories, but not in the gig economy at one point of time. But then, however, right now you could see that there is a lot of change that is happening in terms of, the pull factors of rural to urban migration because of the emerging gig sector, and as well as the nature of the work of these migrants that they are engaging is also changing. So this is a changing scenario that is happening in India, and this conversation has to be brought in to the conversation, larger conversation around migration and gig work. Also, we could see that new migration corridors are actually emerging because of the expansion of gig sector. Say, for instance, my own state, Kerala, you could see many migrants from other states are coming to Kerala and actually working in the gig sector, because for them, since the language barrier is a major issue in India, by the way, we have so many languages, and that's a real barrier within the same country. So gig economy platform is giving them that opportunity to somehow manage the language barrier otherwise. So that is also happening in that sense. And also there are certain other characteristics. Yes, like age, for instance, class, for instance. When we talk about India, we should talk about caste then. Obviously, then certain past experiences or qualifications, etc., all these matters. Obviously, gender is something which we can't really miss out in any of these conversations. And the evidence shows that gig work can provide market-driven solutions to, their restricted, otherwise restricted physical and social mobility. And it's really, actually a positive trend that many of these platform companies are actually proactively recruiting women, like for instance Uber or Big Basket. That's really something which is, I think, something which has to be projected. My last point, I know Niels is showing me that my time is yeah, so this is my last point, which is about the policy sector scenario that is happening in the country with related to gig work, and otherwise also all the rest of the categories of informal work. So recently there is this social security code which has been passed by the Indian government, and it's actually incorporating for the very first time gig workers and all the other informal workers to the I would say to the purview of labor laws in India. So I'm not saying that that's actually formalizing this work or this categories of informal workers, but this is surely a positive approach from the government side. However, there is, when we actually go through this Social Security Code of 2020, we could see that the real concern is the practical issues related to the implementation of several of these provisions in the code. I'll stop here. Thank you so much for listening. And I'm happy to discuss, any of these aspects with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Divya. Chris, you're up next. Let's see if you can do the 3 minutes, more or less.
Sure thing. So I'm going to speak with enthusiasm about the potential of these platforms to create decent work for young people and migrants in Africa. To explain why I'm excited, firstly, in comparison to the narrative in Europe and North America about how many of these platforms tore apart full-time jobs with a range of benefits into irregular, unreliable gigs, those formal jobs in most markets in sub-Saharan Africa never existed. The economy in Kenya, where I live, is highly informal. 83% of employment comes from the informal space. That means that many of these platforms actually are creating more regularity and formality that exists in with the status quo, often with higher wages that exist in the truly informal space. Secondly, these platforms do create an opportunity to overcome some of, although not all, social and geographic barriers. In a context where a lot of work is given by who you know or where you are, some of these platforms can overcome those barriers. Thirdly, a number of these platforms have proven to be upskillers in the African context, often by necessity rather than by design. Uber in Kenya needs to train all of its workers on customer service and how to read maps. Many e-commerce marketplaces train their merchants on business skills and inventory management just to be able to manage an effective platform. It's something that you don't really see elsewhere, but it means that there is a huge opportunity for platform-based upskilling in this market. Now, we heard about kind of how these platforms have low barriers to entry, but I would argue that they do more than that. They provide infrastructure for self-employment, particularly in a context like Kenya's. Having run a gig matching platform for skilled tradespeople in Nairobi, we used to say that what we really provided more than work was the entrepreneurship infrastructure, which enabled people to manage their businesses through tools, materials, insurance, as well as the clients that came with it, which meant that many young people in particular were able to get kicked off on the platform where they were struggling to start their own businesses elsewhere. Now, that's kind of why I'm excited about platforms at large in Africa. Why am I excited about platforms for migrants in Africa? Well, it's basically the same reasons as the above, but arguably more so. I talked about how these platforms can provide the entrepreneurship infrastructure, but in a a quick chat I had with Niels before the panel, he talked about how platforms can provide the arrival infrastructure for those entering into new places. I'm aware that in Argentina and Chile, fully 70 or 80% of delivery riders on platforms are immigrants, largely Venezuelan. And in such contexts where there's a lot of asylum seekers or forced immigrants, there are actually some benefits to the legal gray area around contracting that we generally see as quite a negative thing. So just to briefly say what's missing for us in this space. So we're trying to lead an ecosystem building initiative around job tech, because job tech is actually in Africa far from being ubiquitous. Outside of ride hailing and delivery, which we should point out has less than 10% female participation in Africa, most of these platforms are struggling to find scalable and viable business solutions. In part, this is because of the huge operational burden of upskilling and capacitating workers to really make the most of the platforms. I'd also say that what we're trying to do, more than just responding to what Laura was saying about making sure that platform work is not the only option, I think we should also think through about how we can make it a better option by making sure that these platforms really embed impact inclusion, platform-based upskilling, and career growth as core into their models. And that's really what we're trying to work on. And I'm excited how in Africa, where these platforms are not yet truly ubiquitous, we're ahead of the curve and might have the opportunity to guide them in the right direction. Niels, back to you.
Thank you. I felt we were like newscasters. Back to you. Okay. Thank you, Chris. Well, Jesus, where do I start? There's a high density session here. Do I start where I wanted to start, or do I start by something that piqued my interest? I think it's going to be the latter. Namely, Chris, I'll start with you. And of course, Divya, feel free to chime in also in relation to what I'm about to ask. Namely, I thought it was interesting that you spoke of the arrival infrastructures that platforms can present to migrants in the Argentinian context. And it's actually interesting because a lot of Argentinians then come to Germany and find in platforms their arrival infrastructures in Berlin. But in your own context in Kenya, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see that as your primary context of work and life. You talk not about arrival structure, but of entrepreneurial infrastructure, right? And I wonder, can you tell me a little bit more about what that even means, entrepreneurial infrastructure? Because in kind of a more pessimistic reading, and you know by now that I'm pretty good at those, I can see them that you're trying to also with the job tech platform, right, or the organization, you're trying to turn all, in this case, migrant workers from within Kenya or maybe outside other countries, other regions, into their own bosses, into entrepreneurs, and that seems that that requires a bit more than just tech. We see that in Europe, we see that in the US, but probably in different ways. We see that in India and in the East African context. But I'm sure you don't mean it that way, right? It's not just technology. So what do you mean by this business, the entrepreneurial infrastructure, and what needs to happen to actually give migrants a fair or good opportunity to make a livelihood, either as entrepreneurs or as workers, right? But what other resources are required here?
Yeah, so the kind of general rule about platforms in the African context is that there was an expectation that kind of tech could solve everything, right? We create a marketplace and then supply and demand meets in the middle and it just works. But what most platforms have discovered, including my own that I ran for 3 years, is that a huge amount more was needed in order to get the balance right between what customers were demanding and the capacity of the workers, the entrepreneurs in the system to operate in that space. We saw high levels of unreliable service and low capacity, both from a soft skills as well as a technical skills perspective. We saw many people on our platform lacking the tools that they needed to work, lacking the access to suppliers where they weren't going to get ripped off. And essentially, our role became at building up each of these pieces of the entrepreneurship infrastructure to enable people to work effectively on the platform. Now, that's our experience. We were a social enterprise and deliberately sought out to do that. But you see a similar perspective from many of the kind of more traditional players, including Uber, that, you know, in Kenya, spends a lot of time trying to work out how to connect drivers that don't have a car to people that do have a car, or provide funding as well as training on both the soft skills and kind of the more practical things around how to read a map. Now, these are just kind of little examples about what is needed in order to capacitate people for self-employment or entrepreneurship. As you say, a lot of people are not naturally built to be entrepreneurs, and particularly for migrants that might lack those connections to suppliers, connections to customers, understanding of this new market. Platforms really need to find a way to build that infrastructure if they're going to thrive on it.
What I was particularly also trying to get at, especially as you continue talking, it's like what we also should not make this distinction between people work in the informal economy and then they become entrepreneurs or self-employed. Of course, in the informal economy, they're also entrepreneurial, right? They're also hustling, they're making it work. They have their own businesses, you know, they have their own connections, their own business portfolio, client portfolios, their own supply chains, networks. So I guess my question really is, and then again, this is a question for Chris and for Divya. You know, what do platforms really add here? Like, to what extent is there formalization, whatever that may entail, of these informal labor markets and service markets really necessary? Who is really helped by that, and who might not be able to participate in the gig economies that, at least when it comes to payment and some other elements, they seek to formalize that, right? So for who does this work? For who doesn't it maybe work?
So I'll maybe briefly touch, and then I can hand over to Divya. So I think there's a combination of what they already do and what they could do as well. And what they already do, as an informal worker in Nairobi, let's say as a plumber, there are a huge amount of risks that you bear, from you know, inability to get payments to inability to get customers outside your immediate geography. And given that, you know, this plumber is probably going to live in a relatively poor neighborhood, they're not going to be able to access a wider base of customers that would either give them more work or would give them some of that career growth that we talk about. So some of the things that these platforms can already do is overcome some of the risks and the access to clients. But I think what you're touching on is we would like to see a lot more. We'd like to see embedded into these platforms more opportunity for upskilling, career growth. I think there's the starting points for within a lot of platforms, but more that's needed. I'll hand over to Divya.
Thank you. So I think the situation is somewhat similar in India as well. But what is actually happening here is that the whole formalization of the sector is I would say government driven rather than the company driven. So here you could see that at one level you could see trainings, for instance, or certain initiatives to say, for instance, to ease the work by, for instance, if it is a case of you know, those working in the beauty sector, the equipments which they use, and you know, the lightweight equipment. So these are some of the providing lightweight equipments with, or maybe like, you know, cost effective products, but at the same time like the quality. So these are some of the effects from the initiatives from the side of the companies. But at the same time, looking at like the complexity of you know, how the economy works in India. Over 90% of people in you know, workers in India are actually working either informally or in the informal sector. So there is already a huge presence of informality in Indian economy or Indian labor market, I would say. And this is in this context that we are talking about gig workers who are, you know, because of the very nature of their work, are informal or undertaking informal job. So that is where I think we are all at this point looking forward to the Social Security Code, the Labor Act, which I have just mentioned while I was, you know, pitching the whole idea. So that is something which we are all looking, because it's kind of bringing these sector of workers to the legal policy, the labor law of the country. I think that's effective, so that the government can actually, and in fact the security code is actually talking about having certain supervisory mechanisms, talking about having social security boards, constituting social security funds that actually goes on upskilling these workers. So it's a very elaborate act, I would say. But then again, we are talking about a country which, again, as I mentioned, a lot of diversity is there. We have a very complicated system of, in fact, the labor law system in this country, especially in the case of labor. Both central government, we being a federal system, both central government and state governments can actually make laws on labor or on work. So you could see 200 plus 300 plus different central level, state level legislations in this country. So this is the complexity that we are talking about, and I would say there are initiatives from the entrepreneurs, from the company side. There are initiatives from the I would say the government side, from the workers themselves. But there is, as Chris has mentioned, there is a lot more to be done in this area and I don't really see any selective formalization here. It's like it's actually trying to formalize at some level this whole gig work and gig workers. That's what is happening.
Thank you. I want to kind of bring it back to a question that I originally wanted to ask, also to bring it back more explicitly to the issue, the topic of migration and migrants in these local gig economies. So could you, each of you, tell me a little bit more about, so what sectors are most prevalent, like what gig economy sectors in Kenya and in the state that you live in India, you see are most dominated by migrants, and who are these migrants? Where do they come from? Divya, you already mentioned both intrastate and interstate migration. Is there a difference when you look at their chances, their opportunities and challenges that they face, also in terms of language, but also in terms of other things? That, for instance, intrastate migrants have more opportunities and find better, make do in a better way in these gig economies than people from further away. So basically my question again is to both of you, who are these migrants, in what sectors do they work, and what makes them turn to this type of work? Because I ask because I know this answer for Laura, from reading her work. I know it from my own work in my context, but I would love to know a bit more about the India, at least that state, I forgot the name of the state that you live in, but your state's context and in the Kenyan context. So can you please elaborate a little bit more so the audience gets a better insight of who we're dealing with, especially?
Chris, you will go first. Okay. Thank you. So in the case of India, as I mentioned, there is this two different sets of migration we could actually see. If we specifically look at, say, interstate migration, people from other states coming to this particular urban center. In for instance, I'm sure you all are familiar with Bangalore in Karnataka, because that's the hub of IT business, and you could see people from different states are actually there already working in formal sectors in the IT field, and that is where coming to the question of language barrier, when people from a non-Kannada speaking state of India, when they come here, but they are actually dealing with people from other states who have already migrated for different other works. So you could see a multilingual population already there in these urban centers. So that is why when we specifically geographically look at those clusters of migration for gig work, you could see, for instance, it's Bangalore, it's Delhi, it's Mumbai, which is already having a multilingual population working there from different states of the country. So this
what sectors, what apps are we talking about that particularly draw in these migrant workers?
Yeah, so I think driving, ride hailing is one sector where you will find majority of these interstate migrant workers. Also, in the case of, for instance, this is actually, I have done a field work and I have seen that, those people who have returned from Gulf countries, from India, the international migration, the largest of the migrants go to the Gulf countries, the 6 GCC countries. And with all the changes that is happening in those countries, actually they are coming back to India. And I could see that, like, while I was doing my research and while I was taking interviews, a couple of these, drivers, Uber and Ola drivers, they were actually returned from Gulf countries, now working in, in this particular sector, but they are from a different state. So I think driving is one such sector where you could see the a very significant concentration. Similarly, for instance, e-commerce platforms would also be, you will find some. But then food delivery platforms, I have seen more, or, my studies have, at least, like, the evidence shows that it's more intra-state migrant workers, because there you actually have to communicate with the customers. So there you will find more intra-state, like within the state migrants.
And do you see among those platforms that receive those types of migrants, do you see somehow that these platforms are also trying to actively seek out the recruit them, accommodate them in terms of language, of the interface, like that they can choose particular languages, that they are otherwise in terms of service or other types of infrastructure being accommodated in particular types of migrant flows of migrant, or is it more universal?
I think it's more the labor demand. They are actually in need of, like, especially during this COVID time. I think this is most, obvious at this point of time, where everybody started ordering everything online, and you need more workers. And so you could see that actually these companies are, and in fact, some companies actually in their contract, in their, mission statement, they actually have included this provision of inclusivity. So largely, some of these companies are actually talking about inclusivity, and they're trying to bring in different, I would say workers from different states. Maybe initially it wasn't anything like, very planned or anything, but then because in India, you could see that this migration is something, interstate and intrastate migration is something which is very normal, and obviously then you have a labor demand. Worker demand, yeah. So then,
the question is, of course, why do they particularly seek out those types of platform work and not others? But maybe I wanted first to put the floor to Chris, because
so the thing is,
I'd first like to also have Chris involved in kind of
sure. Chris,
maybe also take into account that last question. It's like what makes them seek out particular types of gig work, platform-related gig work, and not other types of either formal or informal labor, whatever is available.
Great. So kind of just very briefly explaining who we're talking about in the Kenyan context is both immigrants. In particular, Kenya is one of the biggest hosts of refugees and asylum seekers in the world, with 500,000 refugees in the country. That what's interesting is 400,000 of them are in refugee camps, 2 refugee camps specifically, which means that actually a lot of these platforms are not relevant to them. However, telemigration could be, as we'll be talking about a little bit later. There is a large amount of internal migration from rural areas to the capital. And this is largely driven by employment opportunity. And there you see a lot of movement of those people into ride hailing and delivery. That's kind of the two areas that have really grown. But
not cleaning services, or are they just more invisible?
There aren't really large cleaning gig services yet. There are actually some that employ large amounts of cleaners, but not really from a gig perspective. That hasn't taken off here. But I want to bring up one thing that Divya mentioned, which is really interesting and very present here too, which is e-commerce really as a platform that connects to this space, where e-commerce really targets micro merchants, or indeed people without any businesses whatsoever through a social commerce angle. I know there's huge social commerce online businesses in India, and they're starting to grow in Kenya as well, where you see people being able to sell through WhatsApp and other local channels, as well as through some specially designed platforms. And in particular, you see people coming from different areas of the country, sometimes with a business background, particularly the Somali population, you see a large engagement with some of these e-commerce platforms, which I think is really important to consider as part of this broader platform economy.
Mm-hmm. If you, I don't know if you in your work have talked to some of the people who take up those kind of jobs or develop themselves into like micro entrepreneurs, micro businesses. But again, I'm kind of hunting still, if you will, for some of the answers about what makes them choose those types of app-based work or e-commerce related work over and above other types of work that are available. Because there's always some alternatives. Also in my work, there's always some alternatives, but they're never better. They keep telling me than platform work, at least for a while. Because that's another thing, right? In Europe, it's oftentimes in the US, when you sign up, things start out pretty good. You get good, higher payments, etc., and then slowly you notice that things are going down. So I'm just wondering, like, what makes people take up this type of work in the Indian and East African context, and why, if at all, do they stay, or do you see a lot of turnover here?
I'd say certainly in this context, you see a high amount of turnover. I generally consider the way that most, particularly young people, operate in the informal space here is like navigating a constantly shifting terrain of work, where people kind of move in and out of a number of these platforms. They move in when it makes sense for them. With Uber drivers in particular, as I spent a lot of time talking to them, it is regular income when they can't find it otherwise. It is seen as a more regular source of work than exists otherwise. People often will leave when they get a big contract or a big money opportunity that often exists for a short amount of time. Again, kind of the opposite of the North American, European market. These platforms are often seen as the like secure and regular work that people are more likely to churn or depart for when they get kind of either a short-term contract or a short-term piece of work that will give them more income, or like a larger contract. That's what you tend to see out here.
Divya?
Yes. So I think, what Chris has mentioned, that's actually the case of India as well, but there are certain additional, I would say, factors as well here to talk about. One is this whole, sometimes when you look at these workers who are in some of these gig works, you could see that, these work could be their part-time work. So they might be like, employed in some other sector, but they are also doing this gig work, driving Uber or whatever. So you could see that, sometimes this is also part-time work for them, and they are looking for work, actively looking for work, as well as, I think, when I have those conversations with them, most of them have mentioned about flexibility of work with related to this platform. And that's something which is, I think, especially for the young, and as I mentioned, like the internet users, the digital users in India, and they are predominantly, that young working productive age population. So they are very much comfortable with using digital platforms, and they think that there is more flexibility. Plus, many a times what happens is these migrations related to gig work is actually, it's a kind of a step migration. So they are looking to migrate, and India is having that in its I would say genetics, that people are looking to migrate outside India. So this is something like, from rural, I would say village in Kerala, to they will go to the urban center in Bangalore, and from there they will make some contact, they will save money. So there comes the payment aspect, which Chris has mentioned. So they will save money, and they will be applying for visa to say Canada or Australia or GCC countries. So you could see that this is also very short term for them. Yeah, there is a step migration trend which we could see, and also the demand. In India, see, I stopped taking auto rickshaws, those transportation, long back, and I always prefer Uber or Ola. So there is actually a demand. And the place where I'm staying, there is always like, you have to wait for sometimes to get a cab because your cab drivers are always busy. So there is a demand also there. So I think these are the factors.
So we're almost through with our time. I see. I mean, we're officially already over, but we're carrying over a couple of minutes, and I'm going to take the liberty to just take another 3 minutes. I'm looking at Pauline on my screen, and I'm just saying, okay, can I please? Thank you. So
yes, go on, because
so that means, because I want to ask you one closing question to kind of get that sense of closure, and I'm going to ask both Divya and Chris to answer maximum 1 minute, right? Because then we can wrap up nicely at 10 past. So, I mean, we try to cram in way too much, of course, in this conversation, but this is what I kind of end up with, and somebody mentioned the future of work, right? The question is kind of simple, but it's also very difficult to try to answer that in 1 minute. Namely, are we really, when we look at these gig platforms, especially say ride-hailing, food delivery, maybe cleaning services, right? In the Indian context, in the African context, are we really talking about that this is the future of work for migrants, whether, you know, internal or external migrants? And if so, is that a future we should want? Right? So is this really a future of work? Isn't this more like the past of work in many ways, right? Remediating very old systems of inequality, but also opportunities and other things. Or is this, what part is the future here then? And what is that future? And what does it look like, especially again for migrants? Are we, one more last thing, because that I find that important to tag on, namely, are we not seeing that an integration of migrants in the labor markets, but a segregation, an app-based migrant division of labor, right? So that's the question.
Chris, you will go, or it's me? Okay. So I think the very point that India needs to create more jobs, I think that's where we could actually place gig work as the future of work. I'm not saying this is something which is going to be the only future. That I'm not saying, but this is substantially going to be one way in which, you know, this country is going to employ its young population. Especially that's where, you know, the earlier point which I have mentioned, it's now becoming very difficult for Indians, especially young Indians, those who are you know, semi-skilled, low-skilled youngsters. They are finding it very difficult to migrate to other countries. So, you know, they're actually actively looking for domestic opportunities, and gig economy is an option with great potential for them. In that sense, we could always say that this is a substantial future of work in India, if not the only future. That I'm not going to say. But at the same time, also, you know, when it comes to integration and segregation, that particular part, I could see that so far there is a segregation because, you know, in fact, you know, the other migrant workers who are working in other sectors are some of them are saying that, who are, I would say, like, you know, drivers, but not associated with platform workers, platform, ride-hailing sector. So they are saying that, like, you know, this is two different sectors, and even law says that, you know, labor laws approach these migrants, categories of migrant differently. So in that sense, there is a segregation. But at the same time, with moving time, there is you could see tendencies of integration as well. So it's all evolving and emerging in India. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
So starting in a similar way to Divya, just to give some numbers, last year, 18 million young people entered the labor market in sub-Saharan Africa, and 3 million formal sector jobs will be created. By 2030, it will be 30 million people entering the labor market. So there is a huge gap. There simply are not enough jobs to go around in this place. And this is why this is not the future of work, but it probably is and should be one of the options in the future of work. Telemigration for migrants, hopefully will and can should be another one, and we'll hear more about this, which I'm excited about. But I think what's really important to point out is the platform economy as it currently stands shouldn't be an end state, right? What I hope is that as the platform economy evolves and emerges, we can work towards that platform-based upskilling, those benefits, those things that we currently see these platforms as lacking. And as I said, I'm really hopeful that there is a chance to be ahead of the game. Whereas in kind of Western markets, you know, the platform economy just happened, and then it was left to the regulators to work out and society to work out what it means and what to do about it. Here, is there an opportunity to set up a number of these platforms to be more inherently meaningful from the outset?
Thank you, Chris. And thank you, Divya, again. And thanks to everyone who watched and put in questions. I haven't checked yet, but I will in a moment. I'm going to give the word back to Pauline.
No, yeah, great. And thanks, Niels. Nice panel. And what is your takeaway? Because it's your specialism. to be in this topic. And now you talk with to from either India or with African experience, and you have the experience from Amsterdam. What did you learn?
Well, I learned several things, but the main thing is that it was something that actually came up at the end. The young people and it being, it resonates with something that I am finding in my own work as well, which is that gig platforms are absorbers of migrant labor, especially so-called unskilled. Again, as Ryan already put in the chat, I hate that term, but just for reference, kind of, and there they are serving a macroeconomic function, are starting to, especially again in large urban cities. And in that sense, I think it also is too big to fail. Because if they are all gone, where do all these people go? And so it becomes a huge policy and political problem. And I think more and more people start to see this, especially as migration next to unemployment or the need for jobs will expand. So this is also, I think, why we're seeing so much policy and regulatory activity across the world. So some of the things that Chris and Divya said made me think about these issues. And, we should have another whole longer session to discuss some of these more political, economic, and regulatory issues.
Cool. That might be that, let's say in half a year time, we go deeper into that and try to think about, let's say, a wage floor for everybody in the world, so that that when you work for a platform, that at least it's a good job wherever it is. So there could be a way of thinking about it. Let's continue that. Thanks, Niels. Thanks, the panel.